So can you see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction and for the chance to have the to present here today. This is a real privilege for us to get feedback from this group, and we've certainly been influenced by many from your institution, and so it's a real privilege to have the chance to be here. So what we're going to be talking about today is the post-war politics of de-stratifying reforms. And just to put this in a little bit of context in terms of the broader project, there we go. Okay, so I probably don't need to say this to this crowd, but to sort of remind everyone sort of how radically secondary education systems changed between 1950 and 1980. So in the early post-war period, across advanced industrial economies, on average, only about sort of 20 to 30% of pupils were enrolled in secondary education. And by the end of by the early to mid 1980s, that number was over 80%. So the initial post-war period, which is what we're going to be focusing on today, 1950 to 1980, was essentially the period of mass educational expansion in secondary education. And again, as everyone knows, this happens to some degree to differing rates across places, but the sort of general trajectory is one of expansion across places. But there are substantial differences in how policymakers choose to do that. In some places, they choose to do it through reforms that sort of expand extensive comprehensive systems. In others, they add more sort of high quality, non-streamed or vocational streams to the existing structure of elite academic education, and in others they pursue a mix. Now, what's interesting about this and what motivated this particular paper is that the political coalitions behind de-streaming are actually quite diverse. And so in the Nordic countries, and certainly Suzanne Wiborg's work on this is really sets a standard in terms of setting up deep, in-depth analysis of the political coalitions behind reforms. Here we see the kind of image that we often have of de-stratifying types or de-streaming types of reforms, in which you have very powerful social democratic parties that introduce comprehensive education as part of a larger agenda of social change, which is associated also with the rise of the Scandinavian welfare states. But when we look cross-nationally, we actually see a substantial diversity in these same political coalitions. And so it is true that in the continental countries, the Christian Democrats and other actors sort of very successfully opposed the expansion of reforms that would reduce early selection of pupils and keep in place the selective academic streams that lead to the gymnasia schools. But in many other countries, you see a mix. So in France, it was the political right under Giscard that introduced the Collège Unique, the de-streamed middle school. In Italy, the Christian Democrats negotiated with socialist actors in order to introduce the early sort of scuola media. And in most of the Anglo countries, the political right was involved or implicitly supported moves towards aspects of comprehensive education. The UK is a bit of an exception here. And what this picture on the right shows on this screen is the date of major reforms. And you can see that the red dots are where it was introduced primarily by the political left, the blue by the political right, and purple where it's a mix. And so what we can see when we look at that is that there's not a singular pattern in which comprehensive reforms are introduced purely by the left and resisted by the right. In fact, we see a relatively heterogeneous set of patterns. So in this paper, what we have is sort of two arguments to explain that. The first is that one about the dependent variable. It's how we think about de-stratification. And what we argue is that we can't think about tracking reforms or de-streaming reforms by themselves. We need to think about the way de-streaming works with other packages of policies that may standardize or not standardize the system. So what I mean by that is that what we argue is that when you look at reforms that reduce tracking on paper, so this would be the establishment of some kind of comprehensive structure, some kind of reduction or elimination of early streaming, or the raising of the academic streaming age, that in principle increases a degree of equity in the system by eliminating early differentiation. But in practice, the degree to which pupils experience the same educational conditions depends on how standardized the system is. And so when you de-stream, but you keep substantial, say, private school selection or privileged curricular paths, or teachers in different schools are trained to different standards, in practice, this keeps a form of informal differentiation in the system. And so when we look sort of at these packages of reforms, and Anja will discuss this a little bit more on a measurement side in a moment, what we see is different paths that combine these. So the Nordic countries do indeed move towards de-stratification with extensive standardization of curricular and teacher training next to it. The Anglo and France, Italy, and other countries do also de-stratify, but with much less standardization, which leaves some informal mechanisms of inequity in place in the system. And then finally, the continental countries keep early stratification in terms of streaming at the age of 10 through 12, but they actually introduce substantial quality-oriented reforms that alter the system of standardization. So once we move to kind of a more multidimensional understanding of the reform space, that raises the question of, okay, so how do we explain those reforms? And I'm going to work through that argument in more depth on the following slides. But the short story is that we argue we need to think through reform on two dimensions. First, what might political parties want from changes in these areas of both stratification and standardization? And secondly, what are their links to unions, producer groups, or others in the public sector that might shape their particular strategies of reform? And so we argue in this paper and in the project more generally that we need to think about political parties not as having a singular position towards educational reform, but sort of caught between the electoral constraints and demands from their constituents and the particular linkages they have to those in the public sector, like teachers' unions, or private producers like church actors. Okay, so to make that argument more concrete. So the first thing is, and this is of course a familiar argument, is that parties do just have different goals when it comes to reforming education, in part because they have different constituencies. So in the post-war era, in general, we see parties on the left were more supportive of de-streaming reforms, and parties on the right were more sort of generically opposed to them. But in fact, these stances were not homogeneous across place, as I mentioned earlier, neither in rhetoric nor in actual practice. And so when we look at the debates about de-streaming, and that's sort of what the variety of pictures on the right is showing, we actually see some substantial amount of heterogeneity, particularly in the way that the right positioned itself towards de-streaming. So in the UK, the Conservative Party was, at least in principle, supportive of grammar schools, although in practice at the local level, their positions were more heterogeneous. But we can see parties on the center right across Europe and more generally took a wide variety of stances. So the Conservative Party in the Canadian province of Ontario, which is in power essentially the full time period of the post-war era, moved towards relatively early towards the ideal of a comprehensive high school. And then later they come back to supporting sort of more Catholic schools. As I mentioned, the Christian Democrats in Italy compromise on, in other areas on sort of reducing early academic selection, or at least extending it. So what explains this? We argue that political parties have sort of generic electoral goals that emerge towards education, but they're often more open to specific reform proposals. So for the left, generically expanding educational equity means that they're drawn towards de-stratifying reforms, But for the right, both extensive systems of stratification, so the early streaming that we see in continental Europe, and also sort of more informal stratification that can emerge from less standardized systems, both achieve their goals of sort of balancing a broader electoral constituency and middle-class voters with the more traditional support for their higher income constituents who benefited, at least historically, from more selective forms of education. Okay, so what does that actually leave us with then? If there's a variety of reforms that can achieve sort of parties' generic goals, how do they come to a particular policy solution, or sorry, a particular policy position? Here, we argue that we need to think about the much more sort of concentrated interests that producers in the system have. And so although, so when we think about voters, sort of generally, might think about lower income voters want more equity, higher income voters want lower taxes and potentially sort of more targeted public goods. And these lead to quite sort of general stances towards education. But teachers, churches, and other producers involved in the education system often have very specific preferences over structures of actual organizational design, because this is their bread and butter, and their professional status is tied up with particular forms of organization. And so when we look at the literature on education politics, it's often, this insight is not new, certainly. It's often portrayed as an idea of, well, you have these very diffuse voters that want something sort of generic from the education system, and then you have very concentrated interests among educational producers. And when we have concentrated interests versus diffuse interests, the political science literature suggests, you know, the concentrated interests have the advantage. When it comes to sort of post-war reforms of de-stratification, however, what we argue in the paper is that the producers often had really different interests depending on their structural position in the system. So teachers who were linked to the more academic streams tended to be very vested in preserving them. And these were really the elite upper secondary teachers teaching in gymnasium, grammar schools, and so on. By contrast, primary school teachers and those at lower levels of education often were quite supportive of comprehensive reforms. They saw them as expanding their pay, status, and employment opportunities, and reducing the differentiation in the system between them and elite teachers. And just to give a sense of this, we've just put on the right-hand side of this slide the percentage of female primary school teachers in versus secondary school teachers, just to give you a sense of the differences among these groups in the early post-war period. And what you can see, again, not surprisingly, that in all countries, there's sort of more female primary school teachers than there are sort of correspondingly male ones. And if we had put pay up or other kind of employment conditions, you would see the same thing. So the key point is the concentrated interests around educational reform on the producer side were divided at this point in time. So what does that mean for their influence? How do they manage to influence things if they're internally divided? So the second thing we argue is that the alignment of interest groups to political parties really matters. So there's a large literature on educational interest groups that looks at the way in which these groups may have specific advantages in the policymaking process in terms of influencing outcomes. And this is often associated with the work of Terry Moe, but there's also many others in this field that apply this logic and say teachers' unions or other producer groups have advantages in selecting candidates, in influencing their bureaucracy, and in sort of mobilizing parents in ways that targets benefits to themselves. In the paper, what we argue theoretically is that each of these mechanisms in the post-war era was very much asymmetric across political parties. And so teachers' unions or other producers were often linked to particular political parties in which they could have more influence over candidate selection, more influence over information provision and lobbying, and more influence over mobilization of parents and so on in ways that produced outcomes. That produced interest in their outcomes. And so what we see on the right-hand side of the picture is an example of this. It's a protest against the hobby reforms in France, and what you see is this slide shows a picture of all the teachers' unions, and then they're linked into the communist and the socialist parties. And France is a case where teachers' unions were aligned in many ways with the political left, and thus had mechanisms of influence both through candidate selection in parties, the mobilization of voters, and the provision of information through the party apparatus in ways that could shape policy when the left was in power. By contrast, these same unions were much weaker when it came to lobbying the political right. They had few mechanisms for candidate selection within the Gaullist or liberal parties. They did have some informational provision through the bureaucracy, but it was more limited. And the mobilization of parents against these parties, although existent, had less teeth in terms of electoral sanctioning. Now, the association between teachers' unions and the political left is now fairly widespread, but this actually wasn't necessarily the case in the post-war era. And in particular, the upper secondary teachers who stood to lose from de-streaming reform often had strong links, both through candidate selection and through the party apparatus of Christian democratic parties to prevent such change. And this, we argue, is where the kind of distributive aims of parties meet with the producer groups that dominated early education politics in heterogeneous ways. And so we argue that in systems where the political right had links to elite teachers, and this is many of the Christian democratic parties in continental Europe, this was the case, where the gymnasium teachers were mobilized within the Christian democratic parties, and also, in fact, were an important pool of candidates for those parties in terms of local and national elections. That in these cases, we see the political right moving towards a path of maintaining early streaming, but investing more in the system in terms of quality through standardization. Where the producer groups were oppositional to the political right, and that was the example I just gave with France, but we see it also in many of the Anglo countries where the teachers' unions and other producers were actually aligned more with the political left. Here we see the political right actually de-streaming, but not in a way that really promoted teacher quality or curricular standardization. And so their constituents end up with sort of a more selective form of de-streamed education. Where the political left dominates, they are generally not aligned with upper secondary teachers or elite teachers. They do have strong alliances with the more sort of mass primary school teachers, and thus they're less concerned about reforms that might harm that group and tend towards the kind of more Nordic model of what we call de-stratifying standardized reforms. There are a few cases where the left is cross-pressured, and Anja might speak about the example of the Australian state of New South Wales. And in this case, we see a more hesitant approach. So the key takeaway, and I'm going to turn over to Anja now, is that we see variation in the stances of political parties in terms of what they want from the education system. And we also see very different alignments to the producer groups on the ground who face concentrated costs from reform. And these differences shape the ways in which parties approach the task of reforming. So I'm now going to turn to Anja, who's going to talk about how we measure and sort of show this more systematically. Do you want me to keep sharing the screen, Anja, or do you want to share your own? Oh.
Maybe you can keep
sharing.
Okay, thanks. So to evaluate this claim, we chose two approaches. So we do two different types of analysis. On the one hand, we do a sort of medium and comparison. That means that we have systematically collected and tried to quantify information on the one hand, the determinants that we mentioned. So partisanship in the government and links to teachers between parties and teachers. And then we also try to systematize and then compare outcomes and link this to link determinants and outcomes. And another type of analysis we do is we do a sort of process-oriented analysis. That's like we take a middle ground between a real historical analysis meant to uncover the whole process and a process tracing. So we try to focus specifically on the dimensions that are important for our theoretical argument. That means we focus specifically on which actors intervene in these reform processes, what stances, so what's their position in the process, what kind of alliances they enter with other actors, and then how they update their positions as the process unfolds. As for sources, we rely first on international reports in education systems. These are reports written in parts by international organizations themselves, in part by experts or by local governments, that we use to trace how the systems changed during the post-war period, so how the standardization and stratification of systems changed. Then we rely on a quite large amount of case studies and national literature. There's, especially for some cases, there's a lot of literature on these kind of reforms. And then, especially for the process-oriented analysis, we also digged into primary sources, looking at specific publications or official publications by the actors we are interested in, to see what their position is and how it changes during the post-war period. So, as for the comparative analysis, where, as I said, we try to measure, to quantify and measure reform inputs and outcomes. For the determinants, we had to find systematic information on two things, which our theory sees as theoretically important. That's first, which party was in a position to actually shape secondary reform in this first post-war period. So we did that by measuring political majorities in the cabinets that in 20 countries, 17 to 20 countries, combining using Porogov partisanship score, and we combined that with a score for the identity of the Minister of Education. That's because we are under the assumption that ministers played an important or a particularly important role in these reforms. And then a second question we tried to find a systematic answer is then were these parties linked to specific teacher unions, and which teacher unions, and were they linked to providers. And we did an individual assessment to providers, which we might systematize later on, but we haven't. And we have created a more systematic score to measure parties' links with unions. And I'm going to talk a bit about that, since that's very much work in progress, and we're actually looking forward to hearing feedback on this part specifically. So what we found in the literature is that literature on specific cases often mentions links between unions and teacher unions and parties, but they seem to be different kind of links and different degrees of linkage between these two actors. So in some cases, in some countries, there are actually formal links between certain unions and certain parties. There are some, but very few cases where unions are officially attached to a particular party. For instance, in Austria, for each party, there's a teacher union, and then the biggest one is the Christian Democrat teacher or the center-right teacher unions. And there are other forms of formal links, like when unions officially campaign for specific parties, or when they elect members of specific parties as president, or when they organize internal election along parties in line, or there are even cases where unions are in charge of drafting party programs. That's, for instance, the case in France in some years. But then there also are indirect links where unions are not directly members of a specific party, but they're associated with the trade union congress that in turn is associated with a specific party. We call that an indirect link and also code that. And then there's a third degree of linkage, that's when the literature mentions that some relationship exists, like some specific relationship exists between unions and a party, but does not mention formal links. So we see that as not as these are links that are, where we are a bit more conservative in seeing them as formalized and important. So we code them a bit more conservatively. So we assign to each largest party within a country a score from -1 for alignment with the left to 1 for alignment with the center right, and then a half score to smaller unions. And from the next slide, you can see that, as Jane already mentioned, if we then compute these scores, we see that alignments actually vary across countries. So there's the most well-known cases, that's the German or Nordic cases, where we have primary teacher unions that align with the center left, and then we have upper secondary or secondary teacher unions that actually align with center right parties. We also have the case of France, where all unions align with the center left, so there's no union aligning with the center right. Similar in Australia, where there's only one union. And then, but we have also the case like Italy, where all the major unions actually align with the center right in this period of time. That changes then later. So in the next slide, okay. So what we did next is we also tried to quantify reform outcomes. So that was the determinants. Then we tried to have a systematic visions of how reform look like. And we collected, systematically gathered information on a series of dimensions of how education systems change, both for their stratification and their standardization. So I'm not going to talk you through the whole index, but we collected information specifically on when children are streamed, on whether schools require fees, so secondary education require fees, children to pay fees or not, whether there are academic dead ends and so on. That's all part of what we call the stratification of a system. In the next slide, there are a lot of boxes. You can see that systems are developed, or that the stratification index developed differently in different countries. So reforms have different paces, but they also have reached different degrees of standardization. Here, the highest would be more de-standardized systems, actually. So in cases like Italy, you see a big jump in one reform with the system becoming more de-stratified. And in cases like Switzerland or Austria, the curve or the line is flatter. We also did the same for standardization. And I'm not going to talk you through this, but we already mentioned that. So the next slide, it should be simpler, the system. Here we looked at, Jane already said, a teacher training curriculum and the standardization of exit opportunities. And if we compile all the information, we find these three paths that Jane already mentioned. So we have countries like the Nordic countries, only the Nordic countries like Norway here. These are the countries that do big de-stratification reforms. So they reorganize the tracking, reduce tracking, and mostly in the 50s and 60s. And they also invest a lot in upgrading the quality within the track and upgrading the standardization of the track. So they implement teacher training, the unified teacher training. They outlaw ability grouping or electives, and they also try to limit, in some cases at least, exit into the private system or selective public schools. That's a different case from the case where the right was in power. That's the case which here would be Zurich, but there are other cases I'm going to talk about, which do not do this big de-stratification reform. They do eliminate fees and things like that, but they keep the early tracking intact. This does not mean that they did not reform their education systems, because actually within each track, they actually did a lot of reforms to keep this standardization up. So they also unified teacher training within each track. They standardized the curriculum within each track and regularized upward paths. And they, in part at least, also regulated private education. That's again different from the third path, which we call de-standardized de-stratification. These are cases that also de-stratify the system. So they also implement these big reforms that get rid of official tracking. So children are not tracked anymore, but they keep a lot of internal differentiation in the system. So even if all the children go to the same kind of comprehensive school, they might have very different experiences and also end up with different certificates, which give different signals to employers and to further education institutions. So in this case, the teacher training is sometimes, in New South Wales is one case, they do not standardize teacher training. So in schools, there continue to be graduated teachers and non-graduated teachers teaching. Children can still study towards different certificates. They can take vocational electives, so they can take academic electives, ending up with different certificates. And in the specific case also of New South Wales, but also others, parties actually implement more options for parents to exit this comprehensive system and get their children a selective education, both in private and in New South Wales, also in public schools. I'm going to walk you through each path to show how these paths unfolded. I'm mostly focusing on the common patterns they had and less on the specifics, but we can talk about the specifics in the discussion. So the first path, and that's Probably the most well-known path is the Nordic path. This would be the path where the center-left parties are dominant and where upper secondary or secondary teachers are aligned with the center-right and therefore with parties that are mostly marginal within the systems. These are the systems that end up in what we call a standardized de-stratified system. So the next slide. Thanks. So that's for the reform process leading to this path. These countries, like all the other countries, start out in the post-war period with a stratified, unstandardized system. So children are tracked quite early. They enter schools with very different curricula and very different quality. There is, in the 40s and 50s, strong pressure to reform the system, coming from both scientists, from the economy itself, that there is a strong critique against the system reproducing existing inequalities, but also about the system not being able to identify enough talent for the economy. So there is pressure for parties to reform the system. And here we see that, as the literature described, at the beginning there are some shifts. Still, the left is not entirely sure that they want to solve this problem by de-stratifying, but with time they increasingly shift towards a de-stratification, a position that's favorable to de-stratification. The same with primary teacher unions, they also support de-stratification, and both of these groups find partners within the right in most countries. That's mostly agrarians or liberal parties that agree to at least a non-standardized de-stratification reform. So as these reform processes are described, in most cases, these parties then take primary teacher unions on board, they negotiate reforms with them. The secondary teacher unions oppose these reforms, but they have no means to make the reform, make their opposition effective. So in the end, this de-stratification reform pass, often with large majorities. In the beginning, they often maintain some curriculum differentiation, or they all maintain some curriculum differentiation, meaning that they start implementing what we would call a non-standardized de-stratified system, but then the left eliminates this differentiations later on. So we end up with a de-stratified standardized system. So that's a different path from the path we found in countries where the center-right was dominant, or at least it was in a position to block reforms, and where teachers were aligned with the center-right. This is the case where teacher unions, therefore, or secondary teacher unions, were aligned with those in power. That would be the Germanic case, so Austria, Germany, and most of the Swiss cantons, but also Belgium and the Netherlands. Here again, the story starts in the same way. They have a stratified but non-standardized system. There is pressure for reform and expansion. And here we also see that the discussion is not divided along partisan line at the very beginning. So at the beginning, parties are still seeking their own position. The center-right parties in particular, we find representatives that are actually in favor of de-stratification. On the left is not entirely sure. But with time, it becomes increasingly divided along partisan lines. So we have a center-left that tendentially supports de-stratification and together with primary teachers, and their opponents become denominational providers, the private providers, upper secondary teachers, and increasingly the right, which, as I said at the beginning, was not an opponent. In this system, the right has more power, is often political majority, or is in a position to shape reforms, and that means they are able to tank this reform or to halt these reforms. And we see that the links between upper two stages. So we can see that on the one hand, upper secondary parties collaborate, upper secondary teachers, collaborate with the center-right parties in drafting the program, strengthening their position. So it says connection unstable. Can you hear me still? Okay. And on the other hand, we see that also where these links also work during the implementation and trialing period. So in most cases, these reforms are trialed on the ground. And here it's when also these links between upper secondary teachers and center-right parties actually can play an important role in shaping the reform. And I'll just make one example, the example of Austria. In Austria, the center-right becomes more or soften its position against de-stratification, mostly because the economy is in favor. And they agree on starting trials in the 70s. So compared to trial comprehensive schools on the ground. However, they managed to require that each school has to vote on whether to participate in the trials or not, and that 2/3 of teachers within its schools have to agree to participate in order for a school to participate in the trial. Now the center-right has links to all the gymnasium, or to most gymnasium teachers, meaning that one gymnasium in the entire of Austria ends up participating actually in the trials, meaning that then in turn the center-right, when it comes to power again, is able to say the trials were not effective. We cannot prove that this works, and the reform is halted. What these countries have is an inter-partisan agreement on the need to standardize the system within each track, which actually happens. So it's not that they do not reform anything, they just don't de-stratify their system. And I shortly talk about Belgium because it's a bit of a different case. Here the link is not the determinant link is not between the party and teachers, but between parties and the denominational providers. So in Belgium at the beginning, a bit differently from Germany, actually the right is very much in favor of de-standardizing the system. It's a right-wing government led by religious parties that starts developing the de-stratification reform. It's an internally differentiated, so an non-standardized stratification reform, which they want to implement together with private schools. Upper secondary teachers are against this reform. The left is in favor, primary teachers are on favor. So the only opposition comes from upper secondary teachers. However, the right is not interested in implementing a standardized de-stratification reform. So they do not require private schools, the denominational private schools, to implement these reforms. They leave them the option to opt out if they want. It's because they as we said, the center-right is not interested in standardized implementation of this reform. What happens is that the public sector implements comprehensive education. The private schools, most of the private schools do not, meaning that parents start sending their children more to private schools. So the private sector grows, which becomes a problem for the left, who is in favor of the state sectors. So it's the left that actually starts opposing comprehensive reforms and backtracks and withdraws its support for this kind of reforms. And in the end, the reform is halted. So here we see that this connection between providers and parties can work in both ways. So you can form opposition against a reform if it hurts your own system. And then we have the last part, which we think is one of the most interesting ones. It's also the least well known. It's what we call an unstandardized stratification. It should be unstandardized de-stratification, actually. These are parts that are controlled by the center-right, or where the center-right has an important plays an important role, but where upper secondary or secondary teachers are aligned to the left, or are unaligned, meaning that center-right parties do not have to care like the German parties did about what teachers think in a way. So they can implement or choose their own position more freely. This are actually most of the cases. We include cases like in the continental Europe, France, Italy, but also Japan, Canada, New Zealand, the Anglo countries, and Australia, New South Wales. And a bit later, we're not going to talk about them now, but also the countries exiting authoritarian systems in Southern Europe would go into this category. So here again, the story starts in the same way like everywhere. They start with an unstandardized stratified system. Pressure builds up to reform the system because more education is needed. The center-right is in power. It has no links to teach, so it has no links to groups with a strong vested interest in the present system, except for Italy, and I can say something about that later. So what they do is actually they opt for a de-stratification. De-stratification reforms in all these countries are more or less consensual in the sense that the right-wing parties agree to them, with some exceptions, but the center-right fights to keep the system unstandardized. So that's the main issue for them. They do agree on de-stratifying the system, on implementing comprehensive schools, but the whole discussion then centers on keeping internal stratification, on keeping internal differentiation up. Some of the countries are a bit different. That's where it's actually the left that implements or makes the first step towards comprehensive reform. That would be the UK or Portugal later on, or in the case of Japan, it's actually the US military that imposes these ratification reforms. But then in opposition to the German system or the Austrian system, the right does not eliminate these reforms. So they keep the unstandardized, the de-stratified systems intact and just work towards increasing internal differentiation. So shortly talking about two of the cases which are a bit different, but which work in the same way and therefore end up with an unstandardized de-stratified system. So in Italy, it's actually a case, the one case where it's not that the main center-right party did not have links to teachers, but they have links to all the teachers. So all the teachers are actually aligned, or most of the teachers, including the main primary teacher union and the main secondary teacher union, are aligned with the Christian Democrats in this period. So the Italian Christian Democrats control not only the education department, but all the departments in the first post-war period. And they actually tried in the first year after 1945 to reform the system in a German way. So to expand provision within the stratified tract system. All these reforms failed because one of the two teacher unions, or either secondary or primary teacher unions, are opposed to that and do not agree to this reform. That means that at some points the Christian Democrats have to seek other allies, and they find one in the Social Democrats. With them, they enter a coalition with them in the early 1960s, and therefore the DG agrees on de-stratifying the system. They agree on implementing a comprehensive period until for eight-year comprehensive period for all pupils, and they use then their links to teacher unions to campaign for this reform. So they have strong links with upper secondary teachers. Upper secondary teachers are actually in favor of this reform. So the DG actively asks them to campaign for them, which they actually do. So the reform is passed in 1962, but the main discussion is about this internal differentiation issue. So whole discussion in parliament, in the media, is not actually about this comprehensive structure, but about keeping up curriculum differentiation, and specifically having elective Latin, where like better pupils can get a certificate with a Latin exam that allows them to access upper secondary education. So the whole discussion is about this internal differentiation. And Italy, like these other countries in this path, then ends up with an unstandardized, de-stratified system where there is one comprehensive school, but pupils actually are receive different types of certificates that give them different options at the upper secondary level. And then a very different, but again, from the dynamics, very similar case is Australia, New South Wales. So this is the one case where teachers and the church are aligned with the center left. That's because in Australia, New South Wales, the Irish community was very important foundational for the Labour Party. So the Labour Party has linked to private schools and to Catholic private schools, in particular in this period. This means that the center-left party in Australia, New South Wales is torn between different interests. So on the one hand, we have teachers that are in favor of comprehensive schooling. On the other hand, we have church and denominational actors. They're very much opposed to comprehensive schooling. So they have difficulties finding a position. On the other hand, as we predict, the center-right, which does not have any links to teachers, they're all aligned with the left or to churches, has no vested interest they have to take care of, and they actually are open to de-stratification. They support de-stratifying the system as long as internal differentiation is maintained as in the other countries. So in the end, in 1961, the de-stratification reforms, the so-called Wyndham reform in Australia and New South Wales, is passed because the center-right supports it. So the left is actually divided. It's the center-right votes in parliament that make the reform successful. This is again a standardized reform, these standardized de-stratification reform, And that's because the center right, as I mentioned, is in favor of curriculum differentiation. The center left is in favor of private schools. So the reform, again, looks very different from the Nordic model, and then children are still allowed to go into selective public and private schools. There still is curriculum differentiation within school because the parties are linked to actors who have vested interest in this unstandardized features. So we come to the conclusion. So taking all this evidence together, we would argue two things, mainly two things. That is, to understand this kind of the fact that parties took different stances in organizational reforms in the first post-war period, to understand why they did that and why the reforms in the end looked as they did, we need to do two things. So first, we need a more complex conceptualization of how these reforms looked like. So the literature has tended to focus on this, did they detract or not? We think we have to also consider this kind of whether they were interested in implementing standardization within the tracks or not, because the reforms, as we mentioned, looked very different across cases, the detracking reforms. So we need a more complex conceptualization of organizational reforms. And at the same time, we need to consider parties and how they navigate both the distributional dimension of politics and this productive dimension of politics. So with which kind of vested interests are these parties linked to? How do this link work, and how do they influence how they navigate this system? So as a broad conclusion, we would argue that similar distributive coalitions, so party with similar distributive goal, can actually choose different or have different preference because they are linked to different producer groups.
Thank you, Anja and Jane. This is, I think, a wonderful presentation, very rich in historical detail in terms of how these different coalitions in their links with teacher unions shaped educational reform. I'm sure your presentation has raised loads of questions, so let's open the floor to questions. I suggest that you raise, when you have a question, you raise your hand, and then we can give you the word. Who is going to kick off with the first question? Don't be shy. Well, if nobody, maybe some of you still need to think about some questions. I do have one. I think it's intriguing that you included this second dimension. Well, as you said, most of the literature is on stratification. So with early selection is a major component of that. And then you also add standardization. But as you just said, you mainly looked at it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's within tracks. I was actually wondering whether you have also considered the possibility of looking at, I'm not sure if you consider this to be part of standardization, but looking at the possibility of, let's say, standardization or at least homogenization of the curriculum across tracks. I think this is rather interesting, and probably also has a political dimension to it, because you could have a system that is, let's say, tracked, as in Germany, but that nonetheless has shares many of the same subjects across tracks. And you could have a system like in England, and I'm specifically talking here about upper secondary, that is extremely specialized, where you have next to no overlap in subjects across tracks, particularly across A levels and different vocational tracks. And so I was just wondering, have you considered this possibility of looking at standardization across tracks in terms of the curriculum?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I'll jump in on this, and Anja, you can add something. So we actually, for the lower secondary level, we actually have that as one of our measures of standardization, of stratification, sorry. So we have the age of
Okay.
formal streaming, and then we have the age of curricular streaming. And some countries, those are obviously the same. So if students aren't streamed, then they're also not in different curricula. But in places like the Netherlands, for instance, there's been over the last years, in the 90s in particular, an expansion of the sort of basic curriculum for the first years of the stream system. And so then the streaming age is different than the curricular age. And so that's captured actually in our measure of stratification. But the question about the A levels is interesting because we also have another measure of stratification at the upper secondary level. So when we're looking at the lower secondary level, it took a lot of work, but we actually have been able to measure these dimensions relatively systematically across cases. But when we move to the upper secondary level to replicate this, the challenge of even thinking like, what does stratification mean at the upper secondary level? I think is a conceptually harder thing to get our head around for precisely part of the question, the sort of A-level question raises, like, is it the case if you have highly differentiated curricula at the upper secondary level? I mean, is that equivalent to a form of stratification the way we're thinking about it, or is it something else conceptually? So we've been in our second measure at the upper secondary level, which we didn't present, we've been struggling with precisely that question in terms of how to conceptualize what like a more sort of fluid set of onward pathways actually means in terms of the way in which students are moved through the system. And that becomes important because obviously as time passes, the initial sort of, we have another paper where we look at the effects of these systems, and you can really see if you link post-war birth cohorts to different institutions, that the sort of less stratified ones in the birth cohorts, say 1945 to 1950, 50 to 55, et cetera, these institutions really matter in terms of onward educational mobility, but they really flatten out in terms of these differences, the lower secondary, as you move to more younger generations. And there, I think part of the question is sort of like what's actually happening after in terms of how they're streamed. So we're trying to kind of come up with a way of thinking about that at the upper secondary level that gets at some of the things you're asking about, sort of like this intersection between what a standardized curriculum might mean versus sort of how does that create institutional equality in the system.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you. I'm sure now you've had time to reflect on questions and comments, so please come forward. Well, maybe then just a quick follow-up point on, so you said that you actually did look at the upper secondary as well, although not present, if I'm correct, not presented in this presentation. Yeah, so yeah, well, as you said in your answer, I think indeed what needs to be distinguished is indeed in terms of, say, when you talk about tracking, it can be both, it can be by level and by, which is in a way vertical, but then you can retain basically the same curriculum, which is then tracking by level, and by the curriculum. So then you really have very different let's say tracks in terms of content, in terms of that students are exposed to. I wonder if you could indeed shape, or if you could have that as maybe some kind of conceptual framework on these two dimensions to map upper secondary education systems, where then the English system in upper secondary is then really very, I mean, let's say highly tracked, both in terms of level and in terms of content, whereas then the German system may be tracked by level, but maybe less so by content, because you have subjects like, say, citizenship education or something, which are which are common across all tracks in Germany in upper secondary. Also in the Netherlands, actually, this has happened also in the 2000s, if I'm correct. Yeah, maybe you know, if you have some more thoughts on that, just.
I think that's right. I mean, Anja, you can come in on this. I mean, I think the way we approach this, as like Anja's a historian, I'm a political scientist. Part of the way we approach this was to try and think like, what do people actually fight about? Like, what do they care about? And when we went back to the historical record, when we're looking at lower secondary education, what was interesting to us, so it's kind of intriguing, was like how much, when you go, for instance, to these fights in Italy, it was about like, should kids learn Latin or not? And you sort of trying to get your head, like, why was that so important for them? And it's because Latin was a passport to an elite upward trajectory. Like, it was the way in which you sort of weeded out certain kids and gave others a passport to a next level that is elite and that gives them a leg up. When it comes to upper secondary, when we're looking at like the fights in the 70s onwards about sort of like how tracked should upper secondary be, the nature of the conflict varies across place, in part because there's a much broader acceptance of some degree of content differentiation. So in very few countries outside of the kind of four-year high schools, is there a view that there should be no specialization at the upper secondary level. So the idea is, okay, so what do you want at the, what would a sort of a hardcore 1970s social democrat want at the upper secondary level? I mean, they want vocational training at that level on the same footing as academic training, and they want the kids in vocational training to have the same onward opportunities. So the question is like, how do you conceptualize that sort of horizontal equity in a system in which you're going to have some content differentiation, and then the vertical equity upward into onward chances? And so there, what we see are the reforms are sort of about creating these ladders between the vocational system to university. So you just see an expansion of the ability of kids to go from a vocational program into a university, or you see the upgrading of post-secondary education to the level of the university, so that those upward ladders exist. And you see more vesting of resources and teacher training in the vocational tracks to kind of create more horizontal equity. What's interesting is that those then sort of start blurring the lines between these programs, and then you see some pushback against that. So as recently as the 2010, when the Swedish right introduced the more recent educational reforms, part of the goal was to sort of reestablish those differences between the vocational and the academic, to get rid of some of that blurring that had been part of this long run project of sort of equalizing both horizontally and vertically some of those shifts. And so I think the nature of conflict at the upper secondary level is somewhat different, but I think the kind of dimensions that we're theoretically trying to push on in this project, think about like, okay, so what do these actors who have like more generic goals about social equity want, and how does that intersect with the particular productive interests in these systems? And we see in that regard, we do see an aspect of a parallel story at the upper secondary level.
Okay.
I don't know, Anja, if you have anything to add to that.
I agree. I think if you look historically, you had a similar debate at the lower secondary level in the very, very early or interwar period or very early post-war period, where the left was still a bit undecided about whether they wanted to push equity by upgrading vocational education, by keeping it separate, but make it like a more valuable path for students, which came from the populations they represented. And then what they actually settled on was another strategy. That's the strategy to be in favor of more comprehensive systems. And today, I think at the upper secondary level, the position have still remained more undefined and less partisan, because you still have these double like strategies, and parties still don't know what their actual position is or should be.
Although I get, well, somehow my sense is, but you know better, that probably the parties on the political left also at the upper secondary level are pushing towards somewhat more of a common curriculum, particularly regarding notions of citizenship education, which they feel are wanting in the vocational tracks. So they would I think generally push for citizenship education in such tracks. I think so.
Yeah.
Because there is this debate that I'm more familiar with, that the children in vocational tracks are merely schooled into becoming good citizens in terms of following the good followers and knowing how to adapt, knowing how to basically the teaching of good manners, how to socially fit in. And the left has always kind of challenged this and wanted to see more of a kind of more active citizenship being promoted also in the vocational tracks. And I would guess that the right would be more happy to leave perhaps things as they are, with somewhat differentiated forms of citizenship education across the academic and the vocational tracks. But I may be wrong here, but
no, I think you're not. No, I think that what we can say is that the left has surely preferences in some subjects. Vocational education, citizenship education could be one, and also they have a preference towards providing these upper paths into universities for pupils coming from the vocational track, and that means that they are in favor of some basic, like academic standards being taught in vocational schools, because that's a way to ensure that university will not close their doors to those pupils. But at the same time, they at the upper secondary level, they don't have this, I would say, unified and strong preferences for a really comprehensive system and standardized system. But partly, yes.
So, now you have had even more time to reflect on questions and comments. So I'm sure some of you will have some comments. We still have about eight minutes.
I see a question from Norman.
Norman? Yes.
Yeah, hi. I'm Norman Crowth. I'm the national official for post-16 education at the National Education Union. And I think what your presentation showed was the need that certainly we have in the field to develop better conceptual understanding of the changes of reforms that have happened. One of the areas that I'm sort of most interested in and have been drawn to the arguments by Marius Bussemeyer was just simply the overall mapping of the different models of post-16 secondary education, how they've developed, particularly under partisan influence, which comes through in your paper. I just wanted to say that I think we do need this conceptual clarification, and I'm particularly interested in the areas of vocational education, in which I do believe that we lack a vocabulary to articulate the interests themselves. So I think what you've picked up on is that, and I would say this for trade unions in general, is that they're torn between a number of agendas. One is the vested interests of members, which is a natural position, but also claims of social justice and equality. But on the other side, though, I think the gap, and I just wanted to leave this as a comment, is precisely around the articulation of skills, because we don't seem to have a very clear position on that, either in terms of its pedagogy, in terms of the curriculum end state that we would wish for. And I'm just going to guess that the hypothesis of this is that we haven't coupled up with the labour market interests with vocational interests. So the wider trade unions, who obviously have members who develop from schooling, don't have a particular interest in schooling, and the school teacher unions, of which we are, one of the largest, are mainly focused upon member interest. So there seems to be a lack of dialogue between the educational area of policy and the labour market and industrial unions' labour policy. And we are currently working on that in an EDGE seminar coming up, but I just wanted you to say that I found it immensely helpful what you've said, and just wanted to leave it there, so thank you.
Thank you so much for that comment. That was also incredibly insightful and helpful for us. Just two comments on that, just in response. So there is this argument in the literature, and Marius Bussemeyer's work, I think you're right, is probably one of the most sort of deep kind of theorizations of this, that looks at this intersection of these interests with the skills. I think we are broadly convinced by that for post-16 to some extent, although I think your comments push at something that we need to think more about. One thing that we argue in the paper itself, though, is that we think that sometimes this alleged elective affinity between vocational training and early streaming is sort of overstated politically, because you can have high-level vocational training and stream at 16. You don't need to stream at 10 in order to get high-level vocational training. So this argument that a lot of the continental European path was driven by Christian Democrats that wanted to protect a particular model of skilling doesn't entirely convince us, in part because there's not the kinds of models of skilling don't necessarily require very early streaming. But what you point to, which I think is really important and requires us to think a little bit more about, is sort of the ways in which private sector industrial unions' interests could be collectively constructed with teachers' unions. And so obviously teachers' unions are sometimes part of general labor confederations, and sometimes they're not. And this is an interesting question about sort of how within the labor movement, then teachers as workers versus teachers as providers of skills for other skilled workers, how that intersects with the sort of collective position of labor. I think we've thought about that a bit, but your comment makes me think that we need to think a lot more about it. And thank you again for that.
Thank you. And then we have one more hand up by Fiona. Please, Fiona, go ahead.
Hello. Thank you. I found this really interesting, and I was really interested in the different aspects of school reform that you tried to include in your typology and struggled with to go and make comparative across all the cases. So my question stems from that, and it's, did you notice any patterns in the debates over whether these school reforms should or should not happen, whether there were particular groups of the school age population that were targeted in these debates in saying that, you know, these reforms would benefit or harm these particular groups, whether there were differences in that across your cases, or similar cases that, you know, like this will benefit children whose parents haven't gone to university, or benefit girls or minority groups, whether there were any common stories or unusual stories you saw coming through in those debates.
Should I?
Yeah, go start, and I'm going to think about it first.
I think that's a very interesting question. I think one story that's across places and that's very consensual, so not all parties agree, it's this rural-urban divide. So there's a general agreement, and especially also the center-right parties and also clearly agrarian parties, they all care about this rural population that are underserved. They don't have access, or they have, for them it's very difficult to access secondary schooling. Everyone agrees with that, and that's what's less politically contentious. So that's the part of this expansion reforms that's actually most, yeah, it's easy to find allies for that part. All the other groups, there is more contention about that. So whether the left often frames this reform as equalizing in class dimensions, so they are targeted at pupils from the lower classes. The right maybe does that, but that's more contentious. I know of research that shows that the expansion, while nobody or not many people talk about girls, it's actually girls who profited from these reforms, but they were not an actual target of these reforms. They just happened to profit from them. And then there's this old religious minorities would be another part. There is always also contentious. So I think whether there is an agreement that some religious minorities in some countries are underrepresented in the higher academic streams, but whether they should be helped by building like gymnasiums that are religious, so targeted to them, or whether they should be integrated into in a comprehensive system is quite there's a big debate about them, I would say.
Thank you, Anja. And then we have just time for one last question from Felicitas. Felicitas, go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for this insightful presentation. I was wondering, because I worked the same topic, but in Latin America, in Argentina in particular, and at least for us, the aid for compulsory education is very connected to the reforms for standardization or stratification or de-standardization or de-stratification. So I was wondering if in your case, that you could see? Have you checked this, because it may underlie the differences between the position towards lower and upper secondary, because in many countries upper secondary is not compulsory.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So almost all of these reforms, the big ones, the famous ones that you know of, are accompanied by a raising of the compulsory age. And what's important there is that that leaves this question of uncertainty. Where do the kids go when you raise the compulsory age? Are they entering a secondary school that's taught by secondary teachers who've been trained in universities, who have subject-specific knowledge? Are they being taught by primary school teachers who have different kinds of training, different kinds of background? That is the professional battleground that accompanies the raising of the compulsory age, and it ties right into the streaming. So the raising of the compulsory age almost always brings up at this time period, what are you going to do about stratification and what are you going to do about standardization? Because it requires answering those two questions. Who's going to teach them? How are they going to be taught, and where? And so the answer to those, then I think for us, the way that gets resolved depends precisely on the kinds of political battles that we're focusing on, that have to do with sort of the way in which these aims kind of intersect with what the interests of the professionals are. And you often do see a sort of split the difference response in these unstandardized de-stratified models, where you end up with a structure that is sort of a mix of the secondary teachers, but it's in a new sort of school, but the existing teachers keep their sort of privileged pathway within that school. And that's where you end up with then some of this informal differentiation that maintains on, even though we get sort of more formally equitable structures.
Okay, I think that is brought us to the end of the session already. It's already 2:15, 17 past 2 in fact. So let me warmly thank Jane and Anja for this wonderful presentation, which I think has given us a lot of food for thought. I'll certainly use your work in my research on upper secondary education. So thanks again, and maybe a small round of applause for our speakers.
Thank you so much for inviting us and joining us, and thanks for all the feedback. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you, and good luck with your ERC project, both of you.
Thank you.
Good. Okay.
Bye. Thanks.
Oh yeah, we will put this session. We'll make this session available on our Lakes website because we recorded it. That's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's fine. And if anyone would like to read the paper, just shoot us an email. We have a draft version. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.